crowd but to the room itself, saying, "This piano's been tuned recently." And Adrian's smile flickered because he hadn't expected that. And then Elijah began to play, softly at first, a single note, then another, as if testing the floor of a frozen lake, and a few people chuckled nervously, thinking this was it. But then the melody took shape, not a classical piece, not something from a program, but something older and deeper, a blues-infused hymn that bent and breathed, and the laughter died, replaced by confusion, then attention, as Elijah's fingers moved with precision that didn't need eyes, his hands traveling the keyboard like they had memorized grief itself, and the music swelled, pulling in jazz, gospel, and something raw and American, something that carried cotton fields and foxholes and midnight prayers. And Adrian sat up straighter, his arms slowly uncrossing, because this wasn't amateur hour. This was mastery of a different kind, the kind that didn't come from conservatories, but from surviving long enough to tell the truth. And Elijah's foot tapped gently, keeping time like a heartbeat. And when he transitioned seamlessly into a haunting variation of America the Beautiful, the room collectively inhaled, because it wasn't patriotic in a shiny way. It was mournful and loving, the sound of someone who knew what the promise cost, and faces in the audience changed. Smirks softened, eyes glistened, phones lowered, and somewhere near the back a woman quietly sobbed because her father had died in Vietnam and she'd never heard anyone play like this. And Elijah didn't stop. He kept going, layering in complexity, quoting classical motifs and then breaking them apart, rebuilding them into something new, something fearless. And Adrian felt something twist in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, envy, sharp and unwelcome, because he realized, to his horror, that this blind man was saying more in 5 minutes than he'd said in decades of flawless performances. And when Elijah finally let the last note fade, he didn't pose, didn't wait for approval. He simply rested his hands in his lap, and the silence that followed was not awkward but reverent, the kind that belongs in churches and memorials. And then the applause came, not polite, not restrained, but erupting, people standing as if pulled up by strings, clapping until their palms burned. And Adrian remained seated, his face pale, because the room had shifted and he no longer owned it. And the host rushed back on stage, flustered, praising Elijah, asking where he trained, and Elijah smiled gently and said, "Life trained me," which earned another wave of applause. And then, in a twist no one expected, Adrian stood and walked to the piano, motioning for quiet, and for a moment people feared another cruelty, another cutting remark. But instead Adrian spoke, his voice tight, admitting he'd intended to make a point, to prove something about talent and discipline, and instead, he cut his head. He'd been proven small, and the confession stunned the room, because men like Adrian didn't apologize, not publicly, not ever. And he asked Elijah what that song was called, and Elijah replied, "It's called Still Here." And when Adrian extended his hand, Elijah took it without hesitation, and later that night the video would go viral. Commentators arguing, about race, about arrogance, about who gets to define greatness. But none of them could argue with what the music had done. Because within weeks, Elijah was invited to play at veterans events, then community centers, then finally at a national memorial where he dedicated his performance to the ones who didn't make it back. And Adrian, true to his word, funded a music program for disabled veterans, stepping out of the spotlight he'd once guarded so fiercely. And the final twist came months later, when a journalist uncovered that Adrian himself had nearly quit music years earlier, hollowed out by pressure. And it was hearing Elijah play that reminded him why he'd started it all. And so the story people thought was about humiliation became something else entirely. A story about how dignity can't be stripped by laughter, how greatness can walk in unnoticed, tapping a cane, and how sometimes the loudest shock isn't a perfect performance, but a quiet man in the dark, who reminds a room full of powerful people what music, and maybe America itself, was supposed to sound like.
Story. Single long narrative paragraph. The night it happened, no one noticed the blind black man at first. Not really, because the Grand Hall in downtown Chicago was filled with polished shoes, silk dresses, crystal chandeliers, and the electric murmur of money and prestige, the kind of place where people believed greatness was announced by tuxedos and titles rather than quiet breathing and careful steps. And the blind man, his name was Elijah Brooks, stood near the wall with a worn cane, his posture straight despite the weight of years, decades that had begun in the red dust of Vietnam, where he lost his sight in a flash of white heat and screaming metal. a war that sent him home with a folded flag, a shattered nervous system, and a mind that still heard helicopters in the rain. And tonight he was here not because he belonged to this glittering world, but because a volunteer from the VA had an extra ticket and said, "You like music, don't you?" And Elijah had smiled gently, because music was not something he liked. It was something that had kept him alive when the darkness first came and refused to leave. And on stage that evening sat Adrian Levant, a world-famous pianist whose name alone could silence rooms, a man praised as a genius since childhood, whose hands were insured for more than most people would earn in a lifetime, and whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his reputation for cruelty, because genius, people said, excused sharp edges. And as Adrian finished a thunderous performance that earned a standing ovation, his eyes scanned the crowd with a predator's boredom until they landed on Elijah, standing alone, clapping a half-second late, his smile serene and private. And something about that smile irritated Adrian deeply. Maybe because it didn't ask for permission. Maybe because it didn't worship. And when the host announced a brief intermission and invited guests to mingle near the stage, Adrian leaned into the microphone with a smirk and said he'd like to invite any brave soul to try the piano, just for fun, laughter rippling through the audience because they knew it was a trap. And before anyone could stop him, Adrian pointed directly at Elijah and said, "You there, sir, with the cane. Ever played before?" And the room went quiet in that thick, embarrassed way, the way silence gathers when decency is deciding whether to show up. And Elijah tilted his head, listening, and said calmly, "Yes, son." A little. And the word son made Adrian's jaw tighten because he hated being diminished. And he laughed and said, "Well, folks, let's give him a chance, shall we? Music is for everyone." Though his tone made it clear he believed the opposite, and whispers spread like cold wind. Why would they do this? Is this okay? But no one intervened as Elijah was guided toward the piano, his fingers brushing the polished wood as if greeting an old friend, and someone hissed, "This is cruel," while someone else muttered, "He'll embarrass himself." And Adrian leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already savoring the moment, because humiliation, to him, was just another form of control. And when Elijah sat down, the bench creaked softly, his hands hovering above the keys, not playing yet, just listening, breathing, remembering, because in that pause lived his whole life. The church in Mississippi where his mother sang while he picked out hymns by ear, the battlefield where a buddy named Calvin died humming "Georgia on My Mind," the hospital ward where he learned to count steps instead of stars, the battered upright piano at the VA center where he played for men who woke up screaming. And when Adrian cleared his throat loudly and said, "Whenever you're ready," Elijah nodded and spoke not to the crowd but to the room itself, saying, "This piano's been tuned recently." And Adrian's smile flickered because he hadn't expected